Thank you so much for joining us today. Um, Before we begin, I also want to let you all know that we will be taking questions and answering questions after the presentation. So if you could please pose your questions in the chat box, I will pose them to our speaker at the end. Um, so thank you again for joining us. My name is Siobhan Robinson Marshall. I am a research assistant at the Center, and on behalf of everyone at the Center for Global Health, Security, and Science and the Global Health Initiative, I am pleased to welcome you all to the Global Health Security Seminar Series. Since 2017, the Center and GHI have co-sponsored this series in a joint effort to promote a greater dialogue surrounding health security across Georgetown University and the wider Washington, D.C. community. And so for our second seminar this fall, we are excited to partner with the Elizabeth R. Griffin Program for Biosafety and Biosecurity Month. So thank you for joining us, and I will now hand things off to Dr. Erin Sorrell, the director of the Griffin Program, to discuss the importance of biosecurity and biosafety.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I think it's just really important to before we are able to introduce our fabulous speaker, Mr. Ed Yu, important to recap that emerging infectious diseases have altered the way our world prepares for, responds, and recovers to disease threats. Biosafety and biosecurity professionals have continued to play an important role in mitigating the threats and effects of both epidemics and pandemics, including this novel coronavirus pandemic. They play roles in many aspects of response and research and are continuously called upon to address challenging problems to protect our world. While biosafety and biosecurity have traditionally focused on these naturally occurring disease threats, we know that science and technology continue to develop. Advances in instrumentation, data management, cybersecurity all present new and additional challenges for our community. The Elizabeth R. Griffin Program at Georgetown promotes evidence-based biosafety and biosecurity practices to protect the health and safety of researchers, as well as frontline workers around the globe. We are excited to engage in a number of activities this month to promote biosafety and biosecurity, including this fantastic seminar series, Safeguarding the Bioeconomy, Biosecurity Needs a Security Patch, badly, by Mr. Ed Yu. Ed Yu is a supervisory special agent in the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. He's currently detailed as a liaison officer at the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of National Security. Mr. Yu is responsible for creating programs and activities to coordinate and improve FBI and interagency activities to identify, assess, and respond to biological threats and incidences. He supports FBI initiatives to build partnerships with the life sciences community, domestically and internationally, and leads efforts to identify and address potential security challenges in advanced biotechnology. His overall goal is to safeguard the scientific community, the life sciences research enterprise, and the US bioeconomy. Before being promoted to the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, Mr. Yu served as a member of the FBI LA Field Office Joint Terrorism Task Force and the FBI Hazardous Evidence Response Team. Mr. Yu has also been directly involved in policymaking efforts with a focus on biosecurity. He served as an active working group member of the White House National Security Council Policy Coordinating Committee on Countering Biological Threats and represented FBI as an ex officio member in the National Institutes of Health National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. He also served on 2 National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine committees, the Institute of Medicine's Forum on Microbial Threats and the Committee on Science, Technology, and Law Forums on Synthetic Biology. He is currently a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Prior to joining the FBI, Mr. Yu had extensive experience in academic research, having worked for 3 years in autoimmune disease research at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and 6 years in human genome therapy retrovirology at the University of Southern California Keck School of Medicine. Just prior to joining the FBI, Mr. Yu worked for 3 years in the commercial biotechnology sector, conducting cancer research and assay development for Amgen. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Mr. Ed Yu here today with us. Thank you so much for your time, and we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Sure. So let me start by saying good morning to everybody, and thank you to Dr. Sorrell and Georgetown University for this opportunity. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. The whole topic for my presentation is going to be safeguarding science. I purposely use this for a variety of reasons. One is to acknowledge, as was mentioned, we're looking at unprecedented times. Yes, we're still in the middle of the throes of a global pandemic, but we also have to acknowledge that we're looking at a revolution in biotechnology. So there have been several visionaries who characterize it this way, that the 19th century was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the 20th century was the information age and the dawn of personal computing and the internet. The 21st century, those very same individuals classify it as the age of biology, right? And they're looking at how biotechnology is going to have tremendous impact, not only globally, but at the individual level. And what that means is not only is there tremendous promise and benefit, but potentially there are going to be some significant security questions that we're going to be faced with. And I think this is a window of opportunity to start recognizing what we're facing and ensuring that we're positioning ourselves to reap the benefits and do the best that we can to mitigate any of the risks or security issues. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Being an FBI agent, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about criminal statutes. But for those of you who may not be familiar, there actually are criminal statutes dealing specifically with biological material. So in Title 18 of the U.S. Criminal Code, Section 175, it just straight up says, crime to knowingly possess a biological agent, toxin, or delivery system for use as a weapon. And what's important to note is that the U.S. implementing this statute, which the FBI is charged to investigate and enforce, not only is it drawing that bright line, preventing the misuse of biology, it really is a profound way of our acknowledging the Biological Weapons Convention, right? And I'll get my soapbox a little bit here, but for those of you who may not be familiar, the BWC, it's an international treaty where majority of the world has signed on to prevent the misuse of biology for use as a weapon. And this law to prevent it, which the FBI carries out, is one way of protecting biology. And I want to note that it's any agent, any toxin. It doesn't necessarily have to be the ones that you hear of all the time, like anthrax, smallpox, Ebola. It could be influenza, it could be HIV. What's important to note here, it's not about what it is, it fundamentally goes to intent, right? What is your intent for use of this particular biological material? If it's for a legitimate protective research purpose, peaceful purpose, not a problem. But if you look at most of the policies around the world, particularly when it comes to biosecurity, it's very much focused on a list of agents, right? And to a certain extent, what you're doing with that particular agent. So a good example of that is the dual use researcher concern policy. Those are still just focused on what it is and what you're doing in it. That sort of has become the definition of dual use, but this really focuses in on, doesn't matter what the material is, what is your intent? And I want to just provide that as context. But I'm going to now kind of walk you through, where is biotechnology, where is biology, how is it heading, how is it evolving? And I look at this as the lab of the future, that with the convergence of biology with the digital realm, the cyber realm, we're coming close to this becoming a reality, where you might be vacationing on a shore somewhere. And it's kind of ironic that I used this slide, a while back, but it's really relevant now under pandemic when you're supposed to be isolated. But if you're on a beach somewhere with good Wi-Fi or a hotspot, you can actually use programs that are online, and you can design genetic circuits, come up with your own project. You can send it off, email it to a company that specializes in turning your idea into your concept into a product. And it could be a self-contained, completely automated robotic laboratory environment. And you turn around and you get your product. How powerful would this be in the future, as far as you're not limited by time or constrained to a physical location. You're really able to leverage your imagination, your creativity, and because you're also going to be leveraging automation, machine learning, it becomes an iterative cycle. And so that way you can really process very quickly multiple experiments in parallel and come up and increase your chances of coming up with something that actually works. So this potentially could be the new normal, which is fantastic. But are we really considering what are the possible security consideration in this space? And here's an example that in 2006, a reporter for The Guardian magazine in the UK sent an email order to a company, and within the email only contained a DNA sequence, those ACs, Gs, and Ts. The individual used his personal address, personal email account, and a personal credit card. And this company chemically synthesized the DNA sequence, and he got his product after a few weeks in the mail. And inside that plastic vial was a DNA sequence for smallpox. And the resulting story was, wow, there are no laws that prevent a terrorist or somebody from ordering smallpox or Ebola and getting it in the mail. And when this story hit, this generated, as you can imagine, a lot of debate, a lot of concern about this vulnerability. Now, I should note that yes, there was the DNA sequence for variola inside that too, but it was only 86 bases worth. And that particular smallpox genome is over a couple 100,000 bases long. So it was completely harmless, but the damage was done. And it should be noted that the private sector, the companies that are involved in DNA synthesis, this was kind of a wake-up call for them. So because of this, they implemented their due diligence, and currently some of the largest providers of DNA are screening their order. So they're screening the DNA sequence, and they're screening their customers to determine what is it that they're producing and who are they selling it to. So a different kind of a close call. But it just showcased that as we become more and more automated, what other vulnerabilities are we potentially going to be faced with moving forward into the future? And just another note that typically when you talk about biosecurity, we almost always, and for good reason, goes straight to the dangerous pathogens and toxins. Well, I just want to give you a thought exercise here that, again, with the dawn of synthetic biology, where you can now engineer microbes and endow them with new functions, new capabilities. Here was a good example of a group. They transferred the metabolic processes out of the poppy plant and put it into basically baker's yeast. So the same yeast that you use to make bread, wine, and beer. And we're able to make precursors for drugs that help with pain control. So like things like to make codeine and oxycodone. Really, really important, especially when you're dealing with a time where there's a big demand for pharmaceuticals, and the supply is particularly challenged. But if you turn this around, you no longer have to just think of nation states or terrorist organizations. What about, for example, drug cartels, the criminal enterprise, right? If this technology got out and was abused or exploited, the intent here is not necessarily an attack, but it's basically to make a profit. And are we thinking about that in the framework of biosecurity? That it's not necessarily the to the potential exposure to workers or to the general population, but the security context here is, what about criminal misuse for profit, for gain? And I don't know how much of this kind of discussion takes place in the realm of biology, but it's a different take on biosecurity that I want to propose to everybody. And here's another example of a different type of cyber security challenge. That in 2017, there was that NotPetya attack. This was a cyber attack that impacted very large companies around the world. It was responsible for billions of dollars of loss. It should be noted, though, that when this company Merck was impacted, it not only froze their ability to work, but it actually stopped their ability to manufacture. So they stopped production for a couple of months, and it got to a point where they make the hepatitis C vaccine Gardasil, and they actually had to borrow some from the CDC to maintain their supply. And so think about that for a second. You know, what happens in a nightmare scenario if you're in the throes of a pandemic and you come up with a vaccine? And typically when you think about cyber intrusions, you think about ransomware or identity theft or credit fraud. But what happens if if you're trying to mass produce a much needed vaccine and then suddenly this happens and there's a pause? That has huge implications, not just from a profit loss, but it may have downstream impact into the potential patient population. So it's a different type of biosecurity where, again, you're looking at the convergence between biology and the digital world. And we're going to be faced with some interesting challenges. I'm really fond of this, that with the evolution of biotechnology, the dawn of synthetic biology, you're actually seeing an expansion of practitioners in biology. So in synthetic biology, you're seeing not just your traditional bench laboratory scientists working, but you're also bringing in computer science scientists, engineers, material sciences. But now you're seeing a growing movement of do-it-yourself biology, or the dawn of the biohacker, where this is a movement where they believe that individuals, not just universities and pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies, should be the only ones able to conduct research in biology. They really believe about that 21st century, about being the age of biology. They firmly believe that the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates is going to be coming from biology. And they really want to be able to democratize it so that whether you're an artist, an architect, or maybe a PhD scientist with a pet project, you should be able to be made available to you the tools to be able to conduct biological research and then come up with some new breakthrough innovations. I mean, that's been the engine of our economy over history, is that individual inventors coming up with some foundational discoveries, and they believe that they should be able to do that. And there have been some phenomenal examples where individuals work in community labs, and it translated into a multi-million-dollar startup company. However, if you don't understand what the community is about, or because they also kind of work in this gray space between where does oversight and regulatory review come in, you have examples of this where Germany threatened that unless you have a permit or a license, that they can actually criminally prosecute you. And I am not aware of any examples of this actually happening. But this goes to show that if there's a lack of communication between the practitioners in the life sciences with the security community, there could be some misunderstandings. But then even worse, if you can imagine, the biohacker community, if you're working in your community lab or a garage at home, by the way, it's always been my intention to clear out my garage and then build my own home lab too. But if this hammer was particularly dropped, can you imagine what the response would be? I characterize it as this, that if you drive the movement underground, you no longer have dialogue, and more fundamentally, you no longer have transparency. And to me, that would be a greater vulnerability and increased risk, because currently, as it stands, you have the ability to talk to one another. The community has the ability to convene and share best practices, not just about how to do these things, but how to do things safely. So there has to be a balance that has to achieve that in the name of safety and security. What are we doing to empower and reinforce the community rather than push it to a point where it almost forms like a black market type movement? I want to posit that if that happens, we'd be less secure. And with some of the other aspects of technology, there are also these these insidious sides that I don't think we really understand. So for one, you know, in China, there was a New York Times story that came out last year where they identified that the government had rolled out what they considered, you know, low-cost medical examinations. It was called Physicals for All, and about 36 million Chinese participated in it. And they found out that the Chinese government was using the clinical samples, sequencing the DNA, and using it to identify ethnic Uyghurs. And so for those who may not be familiar, there's been a series of stories and reporting about Uyghurs, which are an ethnic minority, predominantly Muslim, that reside in the northwestern region of China. And the Chinese government have been actively you know, trying to displace them from their homes and businesses and lands, and been putting them into what they called re-education centers to the tune of hundreds of thousands. And some of them being forced labor. So that's the aspect of what happens when, if you're able to sequence DNA, yes, you can produce, you can generate more effective health treatments, but this transcends any kind of privacy concerns. I classify this as discrimination in high definition. So something that we should think about when it comes to your biological data. And then, you know, this one, the other side of the slide, really captured a lot of attention when a Chinese physician announced that he had used CRISPR, you know, gene editing tools to engineer the DNA of 2 twin girls. And there's been a lot of, you know, debate that are still ongoing about the ethics of this, but I want to take a step back, for example, and to give you a different perspective, that, you know, CRISPR is an amazing tool. In fact, just a few weeks ago, you know, Doctors Doudna and Charpentier won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of how CRISPR could be leveraged. But at the end of the day, it's just a tool, and you're going to see more of these type of tools that have profound impact coming online in biotech. You should know, though, that as vaunted as CRISPR is, it still has its limitations. It still has what they call off-target mutations. They are active efforts to improve the efficiency in targeting and how to better edit DNA. But one of the key requirements to be able to edit DNA more effectively is you need more genetic information. So the more genetic sequences you get, not only into complete sequences, but also at a population scale, right? The more you get, the more you can look at the various idiosyncrasies between sequences between individuals. You can then do a better job at targeting. So the point here I want to make is that as these type of tools come online, as you use synthetic biology tools, biotechnology applications come online, they're all going to be fundamentally data dependent. And with that, I want to propose this. Oh, I'm sorry, the pictures aren't showing for some reason. Okay. So it's the dawn of precision personalized medicine, where data is fundamentally the new resource, the new oil that's going to be fueling what I call the biospace race. I don't think we recognize that we are in the middle of this space race. I think it's also because we haven't been given that Sputnik launch wake-up call moment. I think it's coming soon, and I'll give you an you know, what my thinking, what that would look like. But I apologize, everybody. If the pictures were there, what you would see is a DNA helix to showcase, you know, how far we've come. So, for example, a little bit of history lesson. The first time a human being's entire genetic code was fully sequenced was the completion of the Human Genome Project back in 2003. That effort took the US government 10 years and almost $3.5 billion to sequence one person's DNA. That was then. Fast forward to today, you can sequence one individual's entire genome in less than 24 hours, and the current going rate is about a couple $100. So dramatic increase in capacity and a really, you know, orders of magnitude drop in cost. So we are on tap to be able to sequence every living thing on this planet. We are generating genetic information at an unprecedented scale. The limitation right now, the challenge is not sequencing. The challenge is, where do you store all this data? And as powerful as your genetics are, especially if you want to use that to develop, you know, personalized treatments, it's not enough, because if you think about it, your DNA sequence doesn't change over the course of your lifetime, which is a good thing, unless you happen to be a big X-Men fan, so I don't mean to disappoint. But you need something more, and that I would classify as data over time. So good examples of data over time are things like your medical records, your health insurance information, your family history, your medical history. So it's looking at what have you experienced over time, what conditions have you suffered from or currently undergoing, what treatments had been provided, what drugs had been administered over time, what was your vaccination record look like. So so it's looking at what you've been exposed to, what you've experienced over the course of your lifetime, and that coupled with your genetics, and then brought together in a data pool with other individuals. So it's individuals, same sex, same age range, same demographics, same experience. By analyzing that, you can come up with targeted therapies. That's the goal of precision medicine. And there are several, government level efforts around the world trying to do that, to be able to better leverage individual data to improve medical outcomes. I think one of the best ways of characterizing it is getting the right medicine for the right condition at the right dose at the right time. So that there's a lot of effort trying to make that happen. And then if you think about it, it's not just in the clinical space, but the private sector is all over this too. That companies like your Googles, your Apples out there, they're looking at how do you leverage data to be able to provide it to individuals. So for example, your smartwatches, right? The sensors there track your heart rate. They can look at your, determine how much exercise are you getting, how much sleep are you getting. The next generation smartwatches can track oxygen concentration in your blood flow. I mean, it's pretty powerful. And think about all the various wearable technologies as well too. And the idea being is that if you track your daily activity, you can identify risky behaviors today. So like getting that little buzz to remind you to get up off the couch and get outside and start running. Very, very helpful when you're under stay-at-home orders, right? But the idea being is that get data now to change your behavior to prevent the disease from manifesting itself in the first place. That's great, but then at the same time, they're collecting that data to be able to turn that around and offer you services. So for example, there's been an explosion of direct-to-consumer DNA testing companies. So the companies where you pay a fee, you send in a saliva sample, they'll sequence the DNA in the cheek cells that are in there, and they provide you some interesting information about your genealogy, maybe some genetic markers to give you some insight into your risk for developing things like breast cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's. And yeah, you get some interesting information, but at that point though, you're no longer a patient, you're a consumer, you're a customer. And so there's some interesting challenges there because it's not, you don't have the protections as a patient anymore, right? But when you do send off that saliva sample, do you fully understand when you sign that agreement, do you know where your data is going? Do you know how it's going to be stored? Do you know how it's going to be utilized? But more importantly, do you know who's going to have access to it? Because here's the thing, if you're a victim of, say, credit fraud today, identity theft, you can throw out your credit card, shred them, change them, and change your PIN code as well, for example. And maybe the banks might be able to, get you your money back and make you whole, sort of. But in the biospace, when your genetic sequence is gone, when your biological data is, your history is gone, but specifically when your genetics is gone, once it's gone, it's gone. You can't do anything about it. There's no getting it back. There's no recourse. There's no way you can change it. But the point being is that do we really appreciate what the long-term consequences are? And why that's important is you see in a different take on cyber intrusion, cybersecurity, that I submit that the bad guys know how valuable our biological data has become. And that's why you're seeing specific targeting of biological data. So there have been a series of historical huge cyber intrusions where you see a lot of exfiltration of patient-related data. These types of intrusion are still ongoing all around the world. I hate to say it, but some of the largest intrusions were conducted by a Chinese-based hacking group. But here's the thing, in the wake of those hacks, it goes back to what I just said. What have been our primary concerns? The possibility for identity theft or fraud. But if you look at this one press release, you'll see that parts of the network that contain medical information insurance claims were compromised. When I saw that, that was a punch to the gut. Why? Because that's data over time, right? You're talking about if you can decipher the various insurance codes and the medical reporting, that's insight into an individual's current and prior medical status. You can look at what treatments had been provided, what drugs had been administered. So not only some potential shortcut information on ongoing clinical trial or drug study information, but that is, a very potentially rich medical data over time. And to kind of give you an example, a government leading initiative in precision health is the NIH's All of Us program, where the goal is to get 1 million volunteers to volunteer their health history, their medical history, and their genetics. And again, the whole idea is to be able to then analyze that and come up with targeted precision health procedures. That's great, but they're having a hard time just trying to get 1 million volunteers. But in the wake of these hacks, there was one hack impacted 11 million patients, another one impacted 80 million patients, another one, 4.5 million patients. So on its face, we're talking about a significant percentage of the U.S. population. But theoretically speaking, if that data has been all exfiltrated to China, then if the US, we barely get 1 million, they're already sitting on tens of millions of that type of individual's data. So fundamentally what I'm opposed here is that in a biosecurity context, we don't understand how important that is. That I submit the biologically relevant data is far more valuable, has far more long-term consequence than any identity theft or fraud. And I don't think we fully appreciate that. And I don't think we understand what the long-term, how that data is going to become more valuable over time. And I'm going to talk about that. But again, this means that we have to rethink what does cybersecurity mean. We have to rethink at an individual level how truly valuable your biological data really is. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand what happened to my slides. The graphics are all gone. So in the last decade or so, China has invested heavily in the DNA sequencing market. So what you should have seen here is a list of companies that have come on the market in China that offer large-scale DNA sequencing at a low cost. And so these companies, what's important to note here, many of these have been accredited and certified by countries around the world, including the US, to do clinical testing. They meet or exceed existing privacy regulation requirements, so things like HIPAA. And as a result, many of our universities and companies have either contracted, licensed, or partnered in collaboration with many of these companies to do sequencing. So we send over tumor samples, tissue samples, biopsy samples, and they process it, they sequence it, and yes, clinicians and scientists get that genetic information. But you know what? At the end of the day, they have it too. And do we understand what the risks potentially are? Wow, I don't understand what happens to my graphics. I really apologize, everybody. So here's another kind of a case in point. One of the largest firms in China that does DNA sequencing is a company called BGI. And they don't just do straight up sequencing. That back in 2014, they went to an agreement with the European Union. And with this agreement, they were able to roll out a non-invasive prenatal test kit across 16 European countries. So if you're a pregnant mother right now and you want to check on your child, you undergo an invasive, slightly risky amniocentesis where they jam a large bore needle into your lower abdomen, pull out some amniotic fluid, and it'll take a few weeks to analyze the cells there to come up with your analysis. Well, with this new kit, you just do a blood draw from the arm of the mother. They'll isolate the circulating maternal and fetal DNA from the placenta, they sequence it, and you get almost 90% the same results as you would get from an amnio. So it's faster, it's cheaper, it's definitely safer. And when they rolled this out, they had aspired to get 400,000 pregnant women enrolled in the program. As of 2018, I think the last count was they had more than 2.5 million mothers and their children, for that matter, that had been tested. And what's important to note here is that England and Germany allow these tests in. Those two countries have some of the most robust privacy protection laws in the world. And that despite the fact that the EU has the general data protection regulations that's supposed to be able to protect individuals' rights and to privacy of their own data, this in a way undercuts it all because it's a clinical test. And so do people understand that? And why that's important to note here is that BGI actually published a paper in Cell in 2018, where they took those very same prenatal tests from 140,000 Chinese mothers, and they went beyond the prenatal test screen, meaning they went beyond checking for things like trisomy 21 and other types of heritable diseases. They did whole genome sequencing. They sequenced the entire DNA. And they found out, they were able to tease out the ethnic makeup of the population of mothers, which is already kind of disconcerting. And then they also found out that they were able to look at prior viral infections that the mothers had been exposed to as well. So the point being here is, do the mothers really understand, when you send in your sample, what can be gleaned from it? But if they got this from 140,000 mothers in China, what about the 2.5 million mothers across 16 European countries? So as a patient, do you really understand what's happening when you go into the doctor's office? And there is another company called WuXi, Nextcode, and they acquired their own DNA sequencing capacity. And this is an example where they also got the certification to clinical testing. They are HIPAA certified, and to the point where the state of California has gone on to license them. So what this means is, because this company meets all the existing privacy regulations, clinical requirements, and they probably also offer the lowest price point, the state has licensed them so that as a patient, if you go into a doctor's office and you might require genetic testing, you sign the HIPAA consent form thinking that your data is going to be kept secure and private. But because of this instance, your sample might be getting sent off to this company for processing, unbeknownst to you. So there's a disconnect between privacy and what I classify as national security. And this is happening in California. Because healthcare is such a patchwork, I don't know if similar licensing is going on in, say, in Florida or in Texas or in other states. Because all in the name of, yes, you want to provide, adequate patient healthcare, but with limited resources, they want to save money. I don't know how many of these types of agreements are existing out there. Oh, I'm almost tempted to just kind of quit this presentation and pull up an older one. But I'll try to trudge along here. So what's important to note here is that WuXi got access to that type of data. Well, just last year, they announced that, we're going to be building a vaccine production facility, a large scale one. And because of that, they already have a $3 billion 20-year contract in place to produce vaccines. They didn't disclose who the customer is. But the point being here is that, theoretically speaking, if we're giving access to, for example, insurance information, genetic information, are we inadvertently potentially enabling them to get access to the vaccine market? If you really think about it, again, this goes back to, I think we appreciate what the value of our data is and where it might be going, how it might be utilized. It's also important to note here that those two companies I just mentioned, BGI and WuXi Nextcode in China, both large-scale DNA sequencing firms, less than a year with one another, apart from another, both announced strategic partnerships with Huawei. So many of you are probably very well familiar with Huawei. They are a huge Chinese-based telecommunications company. There are significant national security concerns that have been discussed in the press, in the news. But on its face, this sort of makes sense that if you're generating massive amounts of genetic information, you're going to want to partner with a company like Huawei that has the infrastructure to house large data sets, right? To be able to process it, analyze it, manipulate it. And so it does make sense. And if you look at the bottom part of the slide, that when they in this partnership, they announced that this was in furtherance of China's own precision medicine initiative. That's important to note here, that because when the US, we launched our own precision medicine initiative back in 2015. And year after year, the Congress has been funding it. So up until now, I think we passed the $2 billion mark to promote precision health, which is awesome. But when China launched their precision medicine initiative, their initial capital investment was 9.2 billion compared to us. So to me, that showcases their intent. They're absolutely in it to win it. But again, I don't think we understand how much they're vested in this. And I'm going to change tack a little bit and talk about what's happening in response to COVID. That in the early stages of the outbreak, where here in the US, we try to provide the CDC COVID diagnostic kits, and the initial release had problems, so they had to actually recall it. There was a pause. But during that, that firm in China, BGI, stepped up and they provided 2 types of COVID testing that the Chinese government then authorized. One was RT-PCR based, so that's the one that you're familiar with, where they jam a large swab up your nose and take a sample. And they're only sequencing parts of the virus to try to identify, is there a virus there or not? But for BGI, the other diagnostic was whole genome sequencing, next generation sequencing. So they can sequence the entire virus, which is a definitive way of checking for the presence of virus, but also, more importantly, you get to see if you understand the whole virus because you're getting its entire genetic code. And the very next day, Europe reached out to BGI to access those types of tests. And then in February, at the height of the outbreak in China, in the city of Wuhan, BGI, the company, not a hospital, not the government, but this company went in and in downtown Wuhan built a hospital in 5 days. And with their robotics and hardware, they were able to process 10,000 clinical samples per day. That's huge because, again, if you're sequencing the whole virus and possibly patient clinical samples too, gives you a phenomenal ability to track the virus. So, for example, try to see if there's any potential mutations. And then also, if you're doing the patient, you get some insight into the virus-patient host interaction. So if you want to develop future therapeutics, diagnostics, or even a vaccine, that's highly relevant information. And then what's also really interesting is that BGI took that deployable hospital model and turned that into a health diplomacy tool. So in the wake of this, they've gone out now to 18 different countries as of August and built 58 of these types of labs where they erect them in short order. They bring in their equipment, their personnel, and they start sequencing. And why this is interesting in this press article, that BGI was able to facilitate an agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. And with that agreement, they built a physical lab in Gaza, and they're sequencing thousands of clinical samples per day. You know, you think about that, the U.S. Up until the Abraham Accords, we've been trying to broker some sort of foreign policy in the Middle East region there for decades. But in the wake of a pandemic, when you're desperate, you're able to bring parties to the table and foster an agreement. But again, do they understand the possibility of where the data might be going? And if you're China, though, it's incredibly relevant because you're 80 to 90% predominantly ethnic Han Chinese. And so you've got a very genetically homogeneous population. So in the interest of analytics, it's just straight up statistics. If you want to have more confidence in your data, you need diversity. And so, boy, theoretically, what a way to be able to gain access to that data if you're going around the world and providing this type of access. And here's the thing, at least some people understand by what this might mean. So a subsidiary of BGI offered to Hong Kong free COVID testing. And the Hong Kong population said, thanks, but no thanks. Because if you look at the highlighted bolded text, there was real concern about where their data might be going, right? So yeah, you may want to check for COVID, but hey, if the PRC government has access to it, what happens to that data after the pandemic if they still hold on to it? So there's some real concerns that they get it. What about us? And do we understand that? And there also is the real threat of shortages in the pharmaceutical side. This is a different take in a denial of service from a standpoint of biology, that in the early stages of the outbreak, we had real trouble, challenges in getting PPE. You all recall in the beginning of the year, it was all the talk about we we can't get enough N95 masks. Well, believe it or not, because of what we've done over the past couple of decades, the US has outsourced pharmaceutical production predominantly to China. Almost all of our generic pharmaceuticals come from China. Most of the active pharmaceutical ingredients to our first line drugs come from China. So, you know, I hope it doesn't happen, but if this pandemic, you know, resurges and there's a huge demand, not just for COVID treatment related pharmaceuticals, but pharmaceuticals in general, if there ever was a shortage, most of it is being made in China. So what happens if they decide that, hey, you know, we need it more to take care of our population before anybody else does, you know, existing contracts notwithstanding. So this is a different take on what a supply chain might look like, and the vulnerability. So what happens? And so ultimately the nightmare scenario here is, you know, if China is able to provide most of our drugs already, if they're looking at the fact that they want to get into the vaccine market too, and be advised that, you know, there's a lot of talk about the phase 3 clinical trials that were started in the US, about a month ago? Well, back in June, China started what I would classify as pseudo phase 3 clinical trials, where they deployed vaccines to government and military individuals. They were quote unquote volunteers, but they were already testing their vaccines on their population. And what's really concerning to me here is that China also joined COVAX just a couple of weeks ago. And if you're not familiar, COVAX is this international collaboration among countries to bring low-cost COVID vaccine to the world, especially focusing on developing countries. And, you know, as you can see in the quote, the US, we're not part of that. And so when you leave a leadership vacuum, well, you know what? China is stepping up and to fill that, and they're offering low-cost, almost free COVID vaccine to developing countries. You know, part of winning is just showing up, and I hate to say it, but the U.S., we're really not showing up. And so, if you're deploying, you know, COVID testing laboratories around the world, if you're joining this international coalition to provide vaccines, this is what you want to do to gain prominence in the vaccine market in general. And that's something that China has not been able to attain over the years. But to me, this is what I meant earlier, that I think my gut tells me that I wouldn't be surprised in the coming weeks that China announces that they have an effective COVID vaccine that has been endorsed by COVAX, by the WHO. That will be, to me, the Sputnik launch wake-up call moment for us. That yes, we have Operation Warp Speed here in the US, but if they're able to come out with something that's been endorsed and is effective before us, how does that make us look? And it's not just about showing off, but it really does showcase, you know, what's our confidence level in the fact that we are, at the end of the day, a democracy, and we're doing our due diligence, our best efforts to provide the patient population a safe, high quality product. But if we can't do it and we're not showing leadership at an international level, then where does that leave us? Bear in mind, though, the US is doing a lot, but you don't hear that. It doesn't get discussed often enough. The general public doesn't realize, you know, where are we in the foreign stage. I understand that we need to take care of ourselves right now. But we are living in a global community, and the virus, you know, SARS-CoV-2 shows us that viruses do not respect at all borders. So we do need to look at this in a global way too. So I just articulated that China has potentially access to data all around the world. Well, guess what? It is absolutely just a one-way street. That China, the government passed a law last year that they are absolutely clamping down, regulating any access to biological material or data from their side. So with this, it means that you have to have a hosting Chinese institution if you go into a partnership collaboration with China, and that any data or paths that are derived, that Chinese institution has first right for refusal for ownership. Wow, I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and blaze through this in the interest of time because the graphics aren't working. Bottom line, though, is we have to strike a balance between science and security. I think what's really important here is you'll note that I'm not saying that we stop data sharing, we stop any kind of international collaboration. The answer is not being protectionist, right? science doesn't work that way, especially in the biological space. But also, we have to start addressing security too, that we, let's go into these things with our eyes wide open. How do we strike this balance between safety, security, and innovation? Because it's not just about keeping away or taking back, but it's also really ultimately, how do we set ourselves up to run faster? Not only just from a national competitive space, but how do we better respond to the next pandemic? So just very quickly, what have we been doing about it? Well, for synthetic biology, the US government has put out policy to help companies provide guidance on how they can conduct their business better. As I said, when you're making DNA, many companies have adopted these best practices. So 80% of the world, of the providers in the world of DNA are doing this, screening orders, screening customers. And students, the FBI, we've been engaging students. A good example is IGEM, the International Genetic Engineering Machine Competition. This is a global synthetic biology competition. Over 40 countries around the world have participated in, thousands of students. I had a chance to engage with students, from Europe, from Asia, and as one of the sponsors, we host workshops called Safeguarding Science in the Future. One of my favorite memories is having over 2,500 students participate in our workshop. That was epic. And just to kind of give you an example of what we talk about the BWC, we talk about the other frameworks for biosecurity, but I leave them with these three premises. I guess I sort of deputize them. Is one, be passionate about what you're doing in biology. Have fun, because you won't succeed unless you're really passionate about what you're doing. Second, be guardians of science. You have an individual responsibility to prevent the misuse, abuse, or exploitation of biology. And finally, pass it on. Make sure you become the mentor of those who come after you. And bear in mind, this has not been lost on deaf ears, that the students have taken this on. So here's an example of a team in China that they did a science project, but they also did a security project where they identified 16 Chinese companies that were offering potentially dangerous, hazardous products. These students ordered it, and they were going to ship these dangerous products to their homes. So the students canceled the orders, and they drafted a white paper and sent it to the Chinese government, criticizing them for not doing enough to protect science and the general public. And they actually gave them recommendations on how they could do a better job. That's awesome. And so also the students went on to actually go and present at the United Nations at the Biological Weapons Convention. And this is a quote from the students that, hey, if you empower this up-and-coming generation around the world, that is a real concrete way of ensuring not only biosafety, biosecurity, but the future. And I love the idea of these young people around the world potentially becoming the next scientist, the next business leader, or maybe the next government official, going to places like the UN, and they have an exposure now of what does it mean to become a guardian of science. We also engage the biohacker community over the years and bring them together to meet their local FBI representative and to showcase that we have a shared responsibility to protect science. The fact that this perspective was talked about in places like DEF CON and South by Southwest really showcases that that's where bio is going. That in the fact that you're having biosecurity discussions in fora, not just in places like ABSA and others, is really remarkable. And they actually encourage, hey, invite your local FBI guy to the local biohacker event. That's a home run. But that really showcases that that's how you do security smartly and appropriately. We also effected legislative change that with this passage of legislation in 2017, the US government, if you look at the very last bullet, that now whether a foreign investment in acquisition or merger of a US company that could expose personally identifiable information, genetic or other sensitive data on US persons, that warrants a government review. So it really is the government trying to take on the responsibility of protecting our individual data. The White House also put out budget priorities for fiscal year 2021, so the upcoming year. Their top 10 areas of research priorities, guess what? Bioeconomy made the list. So biotechnology, biosecurity, biosafety made the list. it came in number 6. It actually beat out space exploration. And so as a you know, a bio nerd myself, I geeked out over it. This was awesome. The National Academy of Science came out with a report on safeguarding the bioeconomy. It came out this past February. It came up with recommendations on how to scope the bioeconomy, and came up with some very important policy recommendations. And the bottom sentence is, I think, is really important, that maintaining competitiveness in the bioeconomy is key to maintaining our economic health in the United States and our national security. But it's not just about us. It's about helping other nations too, right? And it's looking at it that way. Oh, I'm sorry, I really don't know what happened to our graphics, but in this final slide, what you're supposed to see here is a smart home, right? Where you have sensors. We already have smart refrigerators to look at track your diet, but think of the in the near future, smart beds, smart toilets to look at how often you're going to the bathroom, other types of smart sensors. And then ultimately your smartphone. Right now, it's a phenomenal data storage platform, but guess what? In the dawn of 5G and the Internet of Things, your phone is going to become a health diagnostic tool. So what happens when you're capturing, I want to submit to you all that these sensors that are all over, are going to be placed all over the place, is going to be capturing your biometric data, your physical activity in real time. And it's going to turn around and provide you better insight into how to improve your health, how to improve your comfort, your ease of access in certain things. It's ultimately going to have a biological application. So this is kind of a warning for us all that it's not just, we should not only have discussions just about privacy, but there ultimately absolutely is national security considerations and thinking about where does that data go, and ultimately how is that going to impact you as a patient, as a consumer, as an individual. We need to have those discussions now. So here's my last slide. This is the Biological Weapons Convention that I mentioned several times. It's just 10 statements really. And the first 3 is, please don't use biological weapons. Please don't use science to make biological weapons, and don't help your neighbors make biological weapons. Focusing on the 4th one, what are you doing at home to protect biological research? What are you doing in your own country to protect science? And finally, do all of that, everything above, to ensure the peaceful, beneficial use of biology. And it's relevant right now if you're working in a high containment lab with dealing with dangerous pathogens, but it can't only be that. If suddenly in the dawn of the age of the information age of biotechnology, we have to expand the discussion. We have to expand the scope of what potentially could be considered a biotechnology, biological threat issue. It just can't be about, someone's going to engineer a virus that's going to cause a zombie apocalypse. Been there, done that, and yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, but with where biotechnology is going, we have to expand that discussion, and we have to do it globally. So with that, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry if I ran a little over time. Got a little thrown with the graphic issues, but again, thanks for the opportunity. And if there's time, I welcome any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and thank you so much. It was super, super interesting. So if you don't mind just hanging on for a couple of minutes while we answer questions, that would be great. And just a reminder to folks, if you do have to hop off, a recording will be available online later. But digging into these questions, the first question is, if the intent is at issue, is the quote unquote lab of the future violation under the jurisdiction of the state with the beach or where the malignant printout is generated?
So I'm gonna expand on that question. Ultimately, it's all about how do you identify intent, I think is the fundamental question. This is where outreach and education is really important. I'll get on my soapbox a little bit here, that why aren't we teaching the Biological Weapons Convention earlier to students? Like for Georgetown and Dr. Sorrell, I know she talks about this, but ultimately, if you're in high school or middle school, why isn't there at least one discussion, one chapter to talk about the Biological Weapons Convention, to talk about the Henrietta Lacks issue, about the Tuskegee experiments, about, the reason why we had the Biological Weapons Convention is biology absolutely had been exploited and abused, even by the US. We had a weapons program up until the 1970s. And so this was an international stand that we will not abuse biology for this particular purpose, because the blowback could be so bad. Now, though, with the scenarios that I proposed, biology is fundamentally open source in nature. That's its strength. So clamping down on it is not the way, it's not going to work. So the best way to address this is, how do you get enough people on board with this to be on the lookout for it? There's a reason why I said guardians of science, right? Is if you make enough people aware of what the issues are, then you're empowering them to be able to using a phrase that developed by DHS, you have to be able to see something to say something, but you have to teach people to be on the lookout to understand what do they need to be on the lookout for in the first place. So how do we train, whether you're that person on the beach, where you're the computer coder making that app that person's using on their tablet, or designing that fully automated laboratory? How are you baking in security to prevent the misuse? Because if you are sensitized to this, security should not be reactive. We should be doing things on the front end. We can be doing things on the front end, because if you get enough awareness, then you can understand, hey, this new application could potentially be abused or exploited in this way. Let me bake in security before I deploy it, or be able to set it up so that I can identify potential misuse and get that flag so that I can then action upon it. So it's really about, how do we get this awareness and education out as quickly and as far abroad as possible? Because that's how you build what I say is a neighborhood watch mentality. Because who best to understand what's going on within the community and potential external bad actors and the members of the community, the people in the hood themselves, right? So that's how you ensure across the spectrum, no matter where you sit in the process of biological research, everybody has a role to play in protecting science.
Thank you. And I think an excellent follow-up is, could the definition of biological weapons under the BWC be expanded to include bioinformation, biodisinformation, or misuse of digital data?
Yeah, I mean, no, I love that, because the Biological Weapons Convention over the years has tried to carve out some time where they can actually assess where science and technology is going. And it would behoove them and us to go back to understanding that it can't just be talking about the dangerous viruses and bacteria, right? We have to address where biotechnology has evolved. And yeah, I mean, we should be covering all those different topics, but not just within the BWC. The BWC just happens to be one important and high profile forum. But it should translate not just in the BWC, but I just already mentioned in your classroom. It also should be companies doing that, whatever product or application they're developing, translating that into us as a consumer, so we can have better informed in how we use our products, and have a better awareness of where our data might be going and how it might be used. So it's across the board. It should not just be the governments involved, but if you think about it, this is a whole of government, whole of private sector, whole of academia, whole of society issue, ranging at the nation state all the way down to us at an individual level. It has implications at all levels. So we need to start addressing it that way.
Yeah, and on a similar topic, what current US statutes protect genetic information of its citizenry from nefarious use or use by companies such as insurance providers? And in what direction do you see these types of policies developing in the US?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. So I just gave you one example of the looking at the bolstering legislation and looking at foreign investments. Before that, though, we already had things like health HIPAA, what I mentioned before, the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. We also have GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. But bear in mind, those are all decades old, right? It's one thing when you're talking about clinical testing in a hospital setting, but it's a completely different thing when your smartphone suddenly becomes a health diagnostic tool. So policies definitely have to, and that's always been historically been a challenge. You know, how do policies keep up with the times, technologically speaking? But that's where we need to. I'm sorry, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that's absolutely why we need outreach and education, because it's going to be individuals like yourselves, the students that are online right now. You know, if you decide to go into policy, you have the bio background now, and this type of awareness has to go into the policy discussions, because that's how we make better legislation or regulation to protect the individuals. And also at the end of the day too, it's also looking at basically consumer advocacy. You know, you as an individual, if you say, no way am I going to let my data be used that way, then, you know, how you spend your money, which app you decide to download, install onto your phone and access what certain types of data on your phone, you have to make that educated decision. And that'll translate into, you know, what you buy, what decisions you make, and ultimately how that translates into your representative in government. Your voices have to be heard. So it can't just happen in a vacuum, because if you understand that this impacts you on a day-to-day level, then you have to communicate that to our policymakers.
Great, thank you. So do repositories like scientific journals and data banks play a role in the democratization of biology and security?
Oh, absolutely they do. Again, that goes back to what I said before. Biology is inherently open source. And so, and I'll reiterate what I said before. There are going to be elements of security that we're going to need, but it cannot just be we need more barriers, right? Or take back things. There are going to be some elements of that if you think about like IP theft and patent and licensing issues. I get it, but in bio, if that's the only way you look at it, that's going to be a losing proposition. It can't just be that. It's how do we, you know, in an open environment, it does mean that we just have to innovate better. We have to run faster. And so those types of databases, making sure that they're safe and secure and responsibly used, but that they also should be the resource, one of many resources to help us to continue to out innovate. That's the way that you get security, is just being able to tackle things faster and more effectively.
And our final question that we'll ask, like you said, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So if the COVAX coronavirus vaccine is the United States' Sputnik moment, in your opinion, what would be the culminating man on the moon moment for this biotechnology movement?
Oh, that's a really good question. So this is not an official FBI statement. This actually came up in those reports that I showcased earlier that we generated. The experts that we brought into various meetings that the FBI hosted, you know, places from companies from Amazon, Google, Intel, IBM, Dell, Microsoft. We challenged them that, hey, this is the future of the US economy built on biological data, the bioeconomy. And the two things they recognize is, well, one is a lot of our policy efforts right now in bio data has been heavily focused on privacy, not on national security. The second finding, which answers the question, is that even before we put the man on the moon, is we need a strategy. We just do not have an overarching strategy to showcase we want to go to the moon, right? And so that strategy brings together, not just biotech, but bring in telecommunications, brings in manufacturing, agriculture, brings in all of it together to understand what are our gaps, where do we want to go, and then a concerted effort, how do we get there? So that overarching strategy just doesn't exist right now. if you think about it, everything has been just reactive, right? One, it has to be more than just health, but just using health as an example. Oh, COVID, respond. We need a vaccine, 300 million doses. You know, H1N1, we need a vaccine. Same thing happened over and over again. H1N1, SARS, MERS, Zika. It's all been reactive. We have to take a step back and understand that in order to get that man on the moon moment for biotech, we have to have vision. We have to have a strategic perspective to coordinate. As I said, the space race example, that brought in all the government, all the private sector, all of academia. We trained students to go into the STEM field to help build the rockets to get us to the moon. We need that same type of initiative to equip and educate our current generation of students to get us there in biotech. I hope that helps answer that question.
No, and so thank you so much. We'll end on that note and just, thinking about either if there's students on the call or as individuals being more conscientious and proactive in this field. But thank you so much, Ed, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you for everyone for joining and for those of you who hung on right now. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Sorrell from the Griffin program for partnering with us. And, remember, October is Biosecurity and Biosafety Month. And so thank you so much. And before we close, I'd also like to remind everyone that we will have our next seminar on November 13th with Ryan Morehard from Ginkgo Bioworks. And as what I believe is an excellent follow-up to this, he's going to be arguing how the case for a robust bioeconomy offering dramatically better and more reliable ways to prevent, detect, and respond to epidemics and pandemics. So thank you again, Ed, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day and leaves this knowing more and being more active and proactive. So thank you.